On a suffocating afternoon in May 1944, the jungle around the Indian town of Kohima throbbed with flies and the distant rattle of machine guns. On a ridge of broken graves and shattered trees, a line of exhausted men in faded khaki clung to shallow foxholes scratched out of the soil. Their shoulder flashes did not say London, Glasgow, or Manchester. They showed tigers, palms, and strange crests from places the British newspapers rarely mentioned. Punjab, Gurkha regiments from the high Himalayas, units raised in Bengal and the northwest frontier. Many of the men on that ridge had never seen England, yet they were the ones holding the gate to India while the Japanese army tried to batter its way through from Burma. Mortar shells fell among them, sending headstones spinning through the air. A Sikh Bren gunner, his turban blackened with sweat and dust, fired until the barrel of his weapon glowed cherry red. Beside him a Gurkha reloaded with the calm of a man stacking firewood. Behind them, on the road curling back into the mountains, lay the last lifeline to the plains of Assam. If this mixed force of Indian, African, and British troops broke, there would be nothing between the Japanese and the heart of the Raj. Yet decades later, when documentaries spoke of Britain's stand in the East, most of the faces that appeared on screen were white. The men who had actually bled into the soil of Kohima were usually cropped out of the frame. To understand how that could happen, and how millions of African and Asian soldiers shaped both world wars only to be written out of the story, we have to step away from that ridge for a moment and go back to the beginning of the age of empire at war. By 1914, Europe did not just rule Europe. The British Empire stretched from West Africa to the Indian subcontinent and deep into Southeast Asia. France controlled vast swathes of North, West and Central Africa, as well as colonies in Indochina. Germany, Belgium, Italy, and the Netherlands held territories carved out on old maps in ink as red as the blood that would soon be spilled defending them. When the guns opened in August and the great powers declared war, the manpower rosters they counted on were not confined to London, Paris, and Berlin. In offices in Whitehall and the Quai d'Orsay, officials quietly added another column to their calculations: native troops. On paper, it looked simple. The empires possessed hundreds of millions of subjects. Somewhere among those millions, there were farmers, herdsmen, clerks and porters who could be turned into soldiers. The war that schoolbooks would later describe as a European tragedy began, almost from day one, as a global harvest of bodies. In villages along the Ganges, in the markets of Dakar, in the coastal towns of Nigeria and the gold fields of Ghana, recruiting parties suddenly appeared with posters and brass bands. Some men signed up willingly, lured by pay that seemed like a fortune or by a chance to travel and test themselves in battle. Others were volunteered by local chiefs who needed to stay in favor with the colonial administration. Still others were simply pressed into service, swept up by police patrols and given a rifle after a few weeks of shouted training. The languages they spoke, Hausa, Wolof, Yoruba, Hindi, Punjabi, Tamil, meant nothing to the officers who wrote their names down in English or French, often misspelling them so badly that their descendants would later struggle to prove a grandfather had served at all. That we understand that the path from a village in Punjab or a farm in Nigeria to a trench in Italy or a jungle in Burma is part of the main road of history, not a side alley. That when we say, the soldiers of the world wars, we picture not a narrow band of uniforms and skin tones, but the truly global army that marched, fought and died. Only then can we say that the forgotten soldiers are, at last, beginning to be forgotten no longer. The question that hangs over all this is not just, who fought, but, who gets remembered, and who does the remembering. The world wars are not dusty museum pieces. They are active ingredients in modern politics, invoked to justify alliances, to claim moral high ground, to stir patriotism. When the story leaves out entire peoples who were essential to those victories, it distorts not only the past but the arguments we make in the present. Nations that forget how much they owe colonized soldiers may find it easier to turn away from those soldiers' descendants today, whether they are migrants seeking opportunity or citizens demanding equal treatment. So when we zoom back in on that ridge at Kohima, or the rocky slopes below Monte Cassino, or the desert outside El Alamein, and we picture the full line of faces that were truly their African, Asian, European, what we are really doing is reloading the film of history with the correct cast. The battles do not change, the dates and casualty figures remain what they were. But the meaning we draw from them shifts. The world wars stop being tales of a small set of nations heroically saving civilization and become what they truly were: vast, messy, tragic, and deeply interconnected conflicts in which people at the edges of empire paid a price far out of proportion to the recognition they received. And if there is any justice to be found so long after the shells stopped falling, it lies in this, that when we tell these stories now in classrooms, in films, in conversations across dinner tables, we speak the names and remember the faces that were once cut from the frame. This is not a reason to diminish their sacrifice. It is a reason to take it more seriously. When we see a photograph of Allied soldiers advancing through a ruined Italian village, and one of the figures in the line is a turbaned Sikh or a dark-skinned rifleman from West Africa, it is tempting to treat him as an exotic detail. But if we stop and imagine his journey from colonized subject to trained soldier to veteran of a global war, then to citizen, or subject, of a new nation with new struggles, we begin to understand that the world we inhabit today is built on layers of choices forced on such people. The borders of countries, the languages taught in schools, the currencies in our pockets, all were shaped, in part, by the victories and defeats these men helped secure. In recent years, cracks have begun to appear in the wall of forgetting. In British towns, plaques have been updated to mention Indian and African regiments. Documentaries and books have appeared that center the stories of colonial troops. In France, debates over the pension rights of African veterans have opened old wounds, leading to back payments and public apologies, however incomplete. School curricula are slowly, unevenly, widening their scope. Yet the work is far from finished. For every well-researched account of the Indian Army in Italy or the West African divisions in Burma, there are still countless family histories waiting to be recorded before the last generation with living memory of those men passes away. Why, then, did it take so long for their contribution to become widely recognized? Part of the answer lies in who controlled the archives and the camera. For decades after 1945, most of the film footage, official histories and museum displays about the wars were produced in Europe and North America. The curators, editors and historians who shaped those narratives tended, unsurprisingly, to foreground the experiences closest to them. A British historian writing about El Alamein in the 1950s might note in a footnote that the 4th Indian Division had held a crucial sector of the line, but the jacket cover of his book would show British tanks and infantry under the Union Jack. Meanwhile, in many former colonies, archives were poorly funded, and the pressing tasks of building new states took precedence over preserving regimental records from imperial times. Family stories survived in living rooms and at funerals, not in public museums. There is another, more uncomfortable layer. Acknowledging how central colonial troops were to Allied victory forces a confrontation with the moral contradictions of the war. The Allied powers framed their struggle as a fight for freedom against tyranny. In many ways, that description was accurate. Nazi Germany and militarist Japan were brutal, expansionist regimes. But for millions of people in Asia and Africa, the banner of freedom under which they fought was held by empires that still denied them basic rights. To talk honestly about African and Asian troops is to expose those contradictions. It means admitting that in 1944, on the beaches of Normandy and the ridges of Burma, men were dying to defend ideals that they themselves would not fully enjoy until decades later, if at all. In Algeria, veterans of the French army played roles on both sides of the independence struggle, some joining the FLN, others staying loyal to Paris. In India and Pakistan, lines on maps drawn by departing imperial administrators cut across the home districts of men who had once been part of the same battalion. The trauma of partition swallowed many of their wartime memories. Survival in the present left little room for reflections on past campaigns. But under all these stories runs a common current: the wars had politicized millions of people whom the empire had previously tried to keep passive. Why, then, did it take so long for their contribution to become widely recognized? Part of the answer lies in who controlled the archives and the camera. For decades after 1945, most of the film footage, official histories and museum displays about the wars were produced in Europe and North America. The curators, editors and historians who shaped those narratives tended, unsurprisingly, to foreground the experiences closest to them. A British historian writing about Alamein in the 1950s might note in a footnote that the 4th Indian Division had held a crucial sector of the line, but the jacket cover of his book would show British tanks and infantry under the Union Jack. Meanwhile, in many former colonies, archives were poorly funded, and the pressing tasks of building new states took precedence over preserving regimental records from imperial times. Family stories survived in living rooms and at funerals, not in public museums. They learned to move in file through thick bush, to set ambushes, to strip and clean a rifle in the rain. One day, their commanding officer informs them they are going overseas again. This time, the destination is Burma. As the convoy snakes up a brown river under a sky that looks ready to fall, Kofi realizes he is now literally on the other side of the world from the people who raised him. When the first shots crack from the tree line and branches explode in front of his face, he is not thinking about Churchill or de Gaulle or the Atlantic Charter. He is thinking about staying alive, about the weight of the pack on his shoulders, about the comrade breathing hard at his side. Months later, after firefights in dripping ravines and nights of standing sentry in waist-deep water, Kofi's unit helped secure a ridge that allows an Allied column to outflank a Japanese strongpoint. The official report will mention African troops in a single line. No one will spell his name correctly. Years after that, when he is back on the docks in the Gold Coast, wearing a frayed jacket that still smells faintly of jungle mold, he will attend a meeting of a new political party led by a man called Nkrumah. When the speaker talks about self-government and dignity, something in Kofi recognizes the same stubbornness that kept him moving up that Burmese ridge. He has already risked his life once for a flag that was not his. He is not sure he is willing to do it again. Stories like this Indian, Nigerian, Kenyan, Burmese, Malay, Caribbean, thread quietly through the background of the post-war decades. In Malaya, men who had served in British units during the war later found themselves confronting communist insurgents in the jungle, sometimes fighting former comrades. In Kenya, ex-servicemen supplied organizational know-how and, in some cases, weapons to the Mau Mau uprising. They were global earthquakes whose shockwaves were carried by men from villages and towns thousands of miles from Berlin or London. And when we restore them to the shot, events we thought we understood begin to change shape. Victories that once looked like the work of a single nation's courage reveal themselves as the product of imperial systems extracting loyalty and labor from far beyond their borders. Defeats start to look less like isolated blunders and more like the predictable cracks in an overstretched, unequal order. To see this more clearly, it helps to follow one of those forgotten soldiers, not as an abstract symbol but as a human being moving through time. Imagine a young man from a coastal town in the Gold Coast. Let's call him Kofi not because he appears in any textbook, but because thousands of men like him did. When war breaks out, Kofi is working on the docks, unloading cocoa and timber for export. Recruiters arrive with promises of regular pay, smart uniforms, perhaps a small pension. They talk about defending the empire against Hitler, but they also quietly remind the workers that refusing the call might have consequences with the colonial authorities. Kofi, like many of his friends, signs the paper. He is issued a number, taught to drill, and within months finds himself on a troopship, seasick and clinging to the rail as the vastness of the Atlantic heaves around him. He lands not in Europe, but in a training camp in East Africa, where British sergeants shout orders in clipped English that he only half understands. Fellow recruits come from Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Gambia. Slowly, they knit together into a company. Many had worn uniforms, handled weapons, and watched European officers make mistakes, panic, or bleed just like anybody else. The aura of invincibility that sustained colonial rule had been shattered. As the decades passed, individual veterans aged and died. Their stories risked dying with them. A few historians, often working far from the spotlight, began to dig into regimental diaries, letters, and oral histories, piecing together the missing chapters of the world wars. But for most ordinary people, the mental picture of those conflicts remained stubbornly narrow. When someone said, "a soldier in World War II," the image that flickered into mind was still more likely to be a white GI in a steel helmet on a European beach than an Indian rifleman at Kohima or a Ghanaian stretcher-bearer in the Arakan. The question then becomes, what does it mean for us, now if we continue to tell the story of the world wars with so many of their central actors missing? What gets distorted, and what possibilities open up, when we put those forgotten soldiers back where they belong, in the center of the frame? It means, first of all, that the wars look smaller and simpler than they really were, like a map where half the roads have been erased. Picture again that ridge at Kohima, or a defensive position outside El Alamein, or a muddy track in the Burmese jungle, and imagine the camera slowly panning across the faces in the trench. If the editor cuts away just before the lens reaches the Nigerian section or the Punjabi platoon, the story we think we know becomes cleaner, more comforting, more ours, in the narrow national sense, but also less true. The world wars were not just European civil wars that happened to involve outsiders. Leaders of future independence movements recognized this new mood. Men like Kwame Nkrumah in the Gold Coast, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria understood that veterans were a crucial audience. Many of the rank-and-file nationalists who would later challenge colonial rule had wartime service records. They brought back with them not just tactical skills but a sense of entitlement to a different future. We did not go to Europe to fight for the freedom of others only to come home and be slaves, as one veteran bitterly summarized it. Yet, at the very moment when these soldiers were beginning to reshape politics on the ground, official narratives at the imperial center were working in the opposite direction toward forgetting. In Britain, the post-war years were dominated by the need to rebuild, by rationing, by the emerging Cold War. Films, books and newsreels about the war tended to focus on battles where British or American troops were visibly dominant. Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, D-Day all took on a near-sacred quality. In commemorations of El Alamein or Cassino, colonial units were acknowledged in passing at best. Sometimes, they were simply described as supporting formations, as if the Eighth Army had been carried to victory only by the courage of men from Manchester, Glasgow and Cardiff. The mechanics of this erasure were mundane but powerful. Photo editors choosing images for newspapers and textbooks picked the clearest, most iconic shots, often of white soldiers, because that aligned with their mental image of the Allied fighting man. Memorial designers carved the names of British regiments into stone while leaving colonial units lumped together under generic labels. Education ministries wrote curricula that condensed vast campaigns into a few lines. In those lines, there was rarely room for the story of a Nigerian gunner in Burma or a Punjabi sapper on the Gothic Line. Then came the INA trials, in which officers of the Indian National Army, men who had fought alongside the Japanese after being captured in Singapore, were tried for treason in Delhi. To many British officials, these were open and shut cases. But among Indian troops, including many who had remained loyal to the Raj throughout the war, the trials felt like an insult. The INA men were seen not merely as collaborators but as patriots who had chosen a different route to the same goal, freedom. Demonstrations erupted outside the Red Fort where the trials were held. Students marched. Workers struck. And, crucially, Indian sailors in the Royal Indian Navy mutinied in Bombay in 1946, raising nationalist flags on their ships and demanding better treatment. British commanders were startled to discover that the sailors' grievances were not just about pay or food, they were about dignity, about being called sons of dogs by white officers, about returning from war to the same racial contempt. Across Africa, similar undercurrents stirred. In Nigeria, Gold Coast, Kenya and elsewhere, ex-servicemen's associations sprang up almost as soon as the troops came home. On the surface, they were mutual aid societies, providing small loans, helping members find work, and lobbying for pensions. But they quickly became schools of politics. Veterans were used to organization, to chain of command, to debating tactics. They had seen Europe, seen the bombed streets of London, the ruined cities of Italy, the rubble of Cannes and Le Havre, and they knew that the white world was not invincible. They had fought German and Italian soldiers and discovered that courage, fear and pain looked the same in every face. The mystique of European superiority had been quietly shredded in the foxholes of El Alamein and the jungles of Burma. They were told that because they had been prisoners, their pay would be drastically reduced. The men protested. They had suffered hunger, cold and humiliation in German camps at places like Frontstalag 181, and now, instead of gratitude, they were being docked wages. Tensions rose. French officers, anxious and perhaps fearful of a mutiny, called in guards. Shots were fired. Dozens of African veterans were killed by the very army they had served. The incident would be quietly buried in French archives for years. But stories of it seeped out, traveling along dockside gossip and market chatter, reinforcing the sense that the empire's promises were made of paper. In India, the tension took a different, but equally explosive, form. The Indian army had expanded from around 200,000 men before the war to more than 2.5 million by its end. Those soldiers came from every corner of the subcontinent. They had learned to operate complex weaponry, to read maps, to organize logistics. Many had served under British officers who, in the field, had occasionally relaxed the invisible wall of race that dominated colonial life. When these men returned to towns and villages where they were expected to step off the pavement for any white civilian, something felt fundamentally wrong. At the same time, the political climate in India had shifted dramatically. The Quit India movement, the imprisonment of nationalist leaders, and the famine in Bengal had all stoked anger. When the troopships finally turned for home, they carried men who were not the same as those who had boarded years earlier. A Nigerian private who had trudged up Italian valleys under shellfire now stood at the rail, staring at the horizon, wondering what kind of respect would greet him in Lagos. An Indian NCO who had watched friends die in the mud of Burma rolled his discharge papers between his fingers and thought about the officers' messes he had never been allowed to enter. A Senegalese tirailleur, his chest decorated with campaign ribbons, tried to imagine returning to a village where his family still had to ask permission from a French administrator to cut new fields or move their cattle. They had worn the uniforms of global powers, seen cities and landscapes their parents had never imagined, and fought side by side with white soldiers who, in the crucible of combat, often came to see them as comrades. But the moment the gangways dropped in Liverpool, Bombay, Dakar or Mombasa, the old rules of empire snapped back into place. In the colonies, the disillusionment was sharper still. In West Africa, demobilized soldiers were often herded into sprawling transit camps while colonial governments worked out how to send them back to their home districts. Pay was frequently late, promises made at enlistment about bonuses or land grants dissolved in strings of excuses. In 1944 and 1945, in places like Burma and India, rising inflation meant that the money they did receive bought less and less. For men who had risked everything, this wasn't just an administrative problem, it felt like betrayal. In some cases, that sense of betrayal exploded into open protest. One of the most telling incidents occurred not on a battlefield but in a railway yard in Senegal in late 1944. There, hundreds of West African soldiers who had spent years in European POW camps were assembled for demobilization. These quiet advances, these small unit actions that rarely made headlines, cumulatively helped crush Japanese resistance in Burma and reopen the land route to China through the famous Burma Road. The victory at Kohima Imphal was later described by British historians as the greatest defeat Japan ever suffered on land. Yet how many people outside India, Africa, and Britain have heard the names of the divisions that held that line? How many know that when the war ended, an African veteran who had marched from Lagos to the jungle and back again might find his demobilization bonus delayed, his pension arbitrarily reduced, while a British soldier beside him received prompt payment and a place in a grateful national narrative? As the guns began to fall silent in 1945, these questions of recognition and reward became impossible to ignore. But before we get to the long, painful story of how these soldiers were forgotten, there is one more layer to explore: what happened when the men who had fought for the empire returned home to societies already simmering with demands for independence. When the troopships finally turned for home, they carried men who were not the same as those who had boarded years earlier. A Nigerian private who had trudged up Italian valleys under shellfire now stood at the rail, staring at the horizon, wondering what kind of respect would greet him in Lagos. An Indian NCO who had watched friends die in the mud of Burma rolled his discharge papers between his fingers and thought about the officers' messes he had never been allowed to enter. A Senegalese tirailleur, his chest decorated with campaign ribbons, tried to imagine returning to a village where his family still had to ask permission from a French administrator to cut new fields or move their cattle. A few hundred miles to the south at Imphal, the situation was no less desperate. Japanese forces had cut the road to the rest of India, and entire divisions British and Indian were encircled. The outcome depended on whether the defenders could hold their perimeter long enough for air power and armored counterattacks to wear the attackers down. Among the defenders were West African troops manning supply dumps and forward positions, often fighting off infiltration attacks at night in torrential rain. When the Japanese offensive finally ground to a halt and the attackers began to starve, the defenders were too exhausted even to cheer properly. Many could barely stand. And yet, when the story of this campaign was told after the war, it was often summarized simply as a British victory in Burma, as if the Indian and African divisions were merely part of the scenery. The jungle campaigns did not end there. For West African soldiers, some of the hardest marching was still ahead. In operations with names like Thunder and Kendall, entire brigades hacked paths through dense rainforest and swamps in the Arakan and Caledon regions, carrying supplies on their heads, crossing rivers on flimsy bamboo rafts. They were tasked with outflanking Japanese positions, appearing where the enemy thought no force could possibly move. Many of these men had been farmers or fishermen along the West African coast. Now they found themselves in another continent's jungle, wrestling with leeches and monsoon storms, following officers who often did not speak their language. If they felt fear or bitterness, there was little space to express it. The language of the official reports recorded only, advance continued or enemy resistance overcome. But retreat was only the first act. In the years that followed, the British Indian, forgotten army, rebuilt itself in northeast India. New divisions were raised, many of them from India and Africa. The 81st and 82nd West African Divisions, recruited from Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Ghana, Sierra Leone and Gambia, were trained for jungle warfare. So were East African troops from Kenya and Tanganyika. Commanders quickly learned that the skills these men brought from home, stamina in harsh climates, knowledge of bushcraft, ability to live off sparse rations, could be the difference between survival and annihilation in the Burmese jungle, where a man could die just by taking one step off a narrow track and getting lost in a green maze. By 1944, the tide began to turn. We circle back now to Kohima and Imphal, twin battles on the India-Burma frontier where the Japanese launched a desperate offensive to break into India. In ring-shaped defensive positions around these towns, British, Indian and African troops fought some of the most intimate, brutal combat of the war. At Kohima, the front line ran straight across the town's small tennis court. Men dug foxholes in the baselines and fought at grenade-throwing distance, trading the ground around the net back and forth in hand-to-hand struggle. Punjabi, Gurkha, Nigerian, British and Burmese soldiers all found themselves on the same ridges, trying to hold out as supplies were flown in and casualties flown out on makeshift airstrips hacked out of the jungle. Gurkhas in soft caps and Indian infantry in steel helmets climbed in single file up GO tracks barely wide enough for one man, carrying mortars, ammunition and sometimes entire machine guns on their backs. Artillery shells shattered the rocks around them, sending shards of stone slicing into flesh. The ground was so precipitous that a single misstep could send a man tumbling to his death. Yet these formations kept pushing, seizing outcrops and holding them under relentless counterattack. In the shadows of the main assault, Moroccan and Algerian Gumiers, colonial troops in flowing cloaks and turbans, used their experience of mountain warfare to infiltrate German lines at night, climbing where others thought no route existed. Their successes helped crack open the Gustav Line, though later, controversy and allegations about the behavior of some of these troops in liberated Italian villages would be used to stain their reputation and make them easier to shuffle off the stage of memory. While the Italian campaign ground on, the struggle in Asia was intensifying into what one British general would later call, the fiercest fighting of the war. The Japanese advance into Burma in 1942 had been a catastrophe. British, Indian and Burmese forces had retreated hundreds of miles in chaos, leaving behind a trail of abandoned equipment and terrified civilians. Among the soldiers stumbling back over the mountains into India were men from the 17th Indian Division, the Burma Rifles, and newly raised African units such as the 11th East African Division. Many had marched for weeks through monsoon rain, eating whatever they could forage. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion killed far more than Japanese bullets. The retreat branded the word Burma as a synonym for disaster in Allied minds. North Africa's battles, from Operation Crusader to El Alamein, became set pieces in the mythology of World War II. The desert rats and the desert fox were romanticized in films and memoirs. Yet the essential fact that the Eighth Army was, in many phases, a majority colonial force was quietly airbrushed. Photographers tended to point their lenses at British regiments. When African and Indian units appeared, they were often described vaguely as native auxiliaries, as though they were merely decorating the margins of the real war. This selective focus had consequences that went far beyond the newsreel. It began to fix in the public mind the idea that the decisive struggle against fascism in the desert had been a mostly white affair. From the deserts, the war crept north, into landscapes where the fighting would be different but the reliance on colonial troops remained the same. In 1943, after the North African campaign ended in Axis surrender, Allied planners turned their eyes to the soft underbelly of Europe and Italy. There, the mountains would be as much an enemy as the German army. As the Allies pushed up the peninsula, they found themselves repeatedly stalled by natural fortresses, ridges, rivers and towns perched on cliffs. One of the most infamous was Monte Cassino, crowned by its ancient Benedictine abbey. For months, Allied attacks crashed against German defenses dug into the rocks below that monastery. In many accounts, the battle is remembered as an American and British ordeal, with Polish troops making the final assault. But on the steep slopes below Cassino, in the gullies and ravines with names like the Gully and Hangman's Hill, the 4th and 8th Indian Divisions played a central role. Yet these mixed African and Indian forces kept attacking, day after day, slowly turning Italian strongpoints into broken rubble. When Karen finally fell in March 1941, a path opened that would eventually bring about the liberation of Ethiopia and restore Emperor Haile Selassie. British newspapers celebrated an Allied victory in East Africa. Few headlines mentioned that the majority of the men who had done the bleeding were African. To the west, across the width of the continent and the Mediterranean Sea, another desert war was taking shape, one that would make legends out of names like Rommel and Montgomery while relegating many of their most important opponents and allies to footnotes. In North Africa, the British Eighth Army was a patchwork of units from across the empire. Side by side with British armoured divisions were formations like the 4th and 5th Indian Divisions, South African brigades, and Free French units whose ranks were filled with soldiers from Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia and Senegal. Imagine, for a moment, a night on the Gazala line in 1942. A sandstorm has hulled itself to exhaustion, leaving the desert under a sky freckled with stars. In a lonely forward position, a platoon from an Indian infantry battalion crouches in slit trenches, listening for the growl of German engines in the dark. Their commander, a young Indian officer trained at Dehradun, walks the line, checking on men who have spent the day under Stuka attacks and the night wondering whether the next flare will reveal a column of panzers coming straight for them. A few hundred yards away, French-speaking West African soldiers of the Tirailleurs Sénégalais man an anti-tank gun, eyes scanning the horizon. On maps in Berlin and London, this battle is about supply lines and oil, about controlling the route to the Middle East. For the men here, it is about whether they will see another sunrise. Why that erasure happened, and what it cost the descendants of those men, is a question we will return to. But first we need to follow them onto the battlefields where they fought into the sandstorms of North Africa, the mountains of Italy, and back to that ridge at Kohima where the fate of India was being decided by soldiers whose names rarely made it into the official histories. In the early years of World War II, before the names Stalingrad and Normandy became shorthand for the turning of the tide, the war for the British Empire was being fought by brown and black soldiers in places most Europeans couldn't have pointed to on a map. One of the first laboratories of this new global conflict was the harsh, jagged landscape of East Africa. When Italy entered the war in 1940, Italian forces in Eritrea, Ethiopia and Somaliland suddenly threatened the shipping lanes of the Red Sea and the Suez Canal beyond. London could not afford to lose that route to India. But Britain had been caught off guard, its regular forces stretched thin, still reeling from disaster in France. So the job of stopping the Italians fell, first and foremost, to African troops. In the blistering heat around Keren in Eritrea, units of the King's African Rifles Askaris from Kenya, Uganda, Nyasaland climbed bare, rocky slopes under vicious artillery fire. Alongside them fought Indian Gurkhas, their kukri knives as much symbols of their presence as their rifles. Italian positions were dug into cliffs that seemed almost vertical. Progress was measured not in miles but in a few yards of stone captured at the cost of dozens of lives. These questions did not vanish. They simmered through the 1920s and 1930s, passed along in port cities and market squares, quietly shaping the minds of a new generation of nationalists. Yet when the world plunged into war again in 1939, the empires reached back for the same lever they had pulled a generation earlier. The British, French and Dutch authorities repeated the old formulas: duty, loyalty, pay, the promise of reform after victory, and once again the colonies answered, sometimes willingly, sometimes under duress. By the time World War II was at its height, more than 2.5 million men from the Indian subcontinent alone were in uniform, the largest volunteer army in history. Across Africa, from Nigeria to Kenya, from Senegal to Madagascar, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and laborers were mustered into units with names like the King's African Rifles, the Royal West African Frontier Force and the Tirailleurs Sénégalais. This time, their impact would be even more decisive. They would fight Rommel's Afrika Korps in the deserts of North Africa, claw their way up the mountains of Italy, and battle the Japanese in jungles so thick that a man could get lost 6 feet from his own trench. They would escort convoys across dangerous seas and man anti-aircraft guns guarding vital ports. They would build roads, railways and airstrips that allowed Allied armies to move and fight at all. And yet the story most people would later hear about World War II would revolve around a familiar cast: British Tommies, American GIs, Russian infantrymen, German panzer crews. The faces from Lagos, Lahore, Accra, Nairobi and Rangoon would again be blurred, unnamed extras in a drama they had helped carry to its conclusion. When the armistice finally came in 1918, the European capitals erupted in celebration. In London, Paris and Brussels, victory parades marched past cheering crowds. White soldiers in neatly pressed uniforms shouldered their rifles for the cameras. Medals were pinned on chests, speeches were made about sacrifice and endurance, and the story of the war began to calcify into something comfortable enough to teach in schools. For the colonial soldiers, the end of the fighting did not bring an end to the struggle. Many returned home to find their promised pensions reduced or delayed, their families impoverished by years without their labor. Some discovered that land they had been assured would be theirs had already been given to someone else. And perhaps most importantly, they came back with questions that colonial administrations had no desire to answer. If they had been good enough to die for freedom and civilization in France and Iraq, why were they not good enough to vote, to sit in the councils that ruled them, or to be treated as equals in the empire they had fought to save? Within months, troopships were pushing out into the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, their holds crammed with men who had never seen the sea before. Some were sent to fight in Africa itself, in campaigns against German colonies that turned large parts of East Africa into a burnt and starving battlefield. Others were carried all the way to Europe. In the winter of 1914, when the Western Front froze into a line of trenches from the North Sea to Switzerland, the 1st Indian Divisions were already disembarking at Marseilles. French civilians watched as columns of Sikhs, Rajputs and Muslims marched past in turbans and unfamiliar uniforms, steam from their breath twisting into the cold air. Many of the soldiers had left behind villages where the daytime temperature rarely dropped below 30 degrees. Now they were being marched towards a landscape of mud, ice and steel. The war did not care about the shock. It needed bodies in the line. At Ypres and Neuve-Chapelle, Indian brigades were thrown into assaults across mangled fields, storming German trenches under fire from machine guns whose existence, back home, they had only heard rumors about. Letters they tried to send to their families described snow falling like ash on the dead and the way a shell could turn a whole group of friends into pieces in an instant. Those letters were read and censored by British officers before they ever left France. Anything judged too honest about the horror of the front was quietly removed. The empire wanted courage from its colonial soldiers. It did not want their fear becoming contagious. That we understand that the path from a village in Punjab or a farm in Nigeria to a trench in Italy or a jungle in Burma is part of the main road of history, not a side alley. That when we say, the soldiers of the world wars, we picture not a narrow band of uniforms and skin tones, but the truly global army that marched, fought and died. Only then can we say that the forgotten soldiers are, at last, beginning to be forgotten no longer.